Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. So in previous videos, we looked at the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. In this video and the next, we're going to look at a design argument or teleological argument for God's existence. But in order to understand it, we need to first understand arguments from analogy. So in this video, we'll introduce the teleological design argument. Then I'll introduce the idea of an argument from analogy. We'll talk about the argument structure, give some examples of this kind of argument. Then we'll talk about how to evaluate arguments from analogy. We'll talk about sort of the degree of similarity, the number and variety of items compared, and the relevance of the analogy. Then we'll talk about different strategies someone can take in trying to challenge an argument from analogy. They can use disanalogy, counter-analogy, or appeal to unintended implications of the analogy. So the teleological argument is often reconstructed as a kind of argument from analogy. So teleological here just has to do with sort of looking at the goals or purposes or ends of various ideas. So the reasoning of teleological arguments for God's existence, they makes a comparison between the universe we live in and machines. And this comparison is meant to support the idea that only an intelligent designer could have created this sort of intricate piece of machinery that is our universe. All right, so this is often reconstructed, as I said, as a kind of argument from analogy. And so we need to reflect on what these arguments are and how they work more generally. So let's look at the structure of these kind of arguments. So an argument from analogy has the following structure. Premise 1. A is similar to B in certain respects. So this premise is making the analogy between sort of two or more things. It's saying, here are two things, and they are similar in these kinds of ways. And then it takes one item in that analogy and says, hey, look, we know that B has these features, F. Therefore, A, since A is so similar to B, probably has that feature as well. So note, this is always an inductive argument. A good argument from analogy will appeal to an analogy that makes the conclusion likely to be true, but it's never going to be able to guarantee the conclusion. No matter how similar two things are, the fact that one of them has a feature cannot guarantee that the other one has that feature as well. But if they are very similar and we point to the right set of features, it might still be inductively strong. So in an argument from analogy, we should distinguish between the observed similarities in the argument. So these are the similarities between A and B that we already know about. So that's the analogy, the similarities we point out when we make the analogy between the two. The inferred similarity is the feature that occurs in the second premise and the conclusion. So that is, we already knew about the similarities that we had in the analogy, and we're using the ones we know about as evidence that there's going to be this other similarity that we don't already sort of know about for sure. All right, so we're inferring that they'll be similar in this extra way as well. So let's consider some examples just to maybe make this a bit more concrete for students. Here's an example. So the entire practice of sort of medical testing on animals is founded on essentially a sort of argument from analogy. So human bodies are similar to mice in various ways. Well, mice have a bad reaction to drug X. In this case, maybe the mice die. Therefore, humans would probably have a bad reaction to that drug as well. The idea is, we know that human bodies are similar to mice in various ways. They have central nervous systems. They have similarities in their sort of immune systems, whatever it might be. And the idea is we haven't tested this sort of drug on humans yet. But since we've tested it on mice and we saw that they died, well, you want to know what? We probably shouldn't test that on humans. All right, so here's another example. Maybe I'm thinking about buying a new car, and I might rely on various analogies to try to make a decision here. So I might say, hey, look, the car I'm thinking about buying is similar to Colin's car. Both are Honda Civics. Well, Colin's car has been very reliable. Therefore, the car I'm thinking about buying will probably be very reliable as well. So the idea is, in that first premise, I note the observed similarities are that both of these cars are the same make and model. Then the inferred similarity is that, well, since Colin's car has been very reliable, probably my car will also be similar in this extra way and also be reliable. Arguments from analogy are incredibly common. We rely on them in numerous different areas of discourse. We rely on them in philosophy, in science, in law. If you've ever heard people talk about the notion of precedent in the sort of legal realm, so when someone appeals to precedent in the law, they're essentially appealing to an argument from analogy where they're saying, hey, this current legal case is similar to this other case that has already been decided, and so it should be decided in a similar way as well. Right. And we rely on it in our everyday reasoning when we're buying cars, when you're deciding maybe what music to buy or what movie to see. You might say, oh, hey, look, this has the same director as all these other movies I liked, so I'll probably like this one as well. You're relying on arguing from analogy. So the question isn't, do you use arguments from analogy? But the question is, do you use them well? Because if you use them poorly, well, they can lead you astray quite a bit. All right, so when you're trying to determine if an argument from analogy is strong or weak, so whether it actually makes the conclusion likely, you need to consider three factors. There's the degree of similarity, or how similar are the things being compared in the analogy. So when I compared the car I was thinking about buying to the car that Colin has, well, how similar were they really? The number and variety of things being compared. So how many things are being compared? How much variety is there in the things compared? So am I saying, hey, look, the car I'm thinking about buying is similar to Colin's Honda Civic? Or am I comparing it to say, hey, look, I know 10 people that all have Honda Civics and they've all been reliable? Well, at that point, when I have more things that I'm comparing it to, the analogy becomes stronger. Similarly, in the argument, I might say, hey, look, well, Colin has a 2017 sort of Honda Civic. Susie has a 2019. Colin drives his sort of all around the country and uses this kind of oil. And sort of Susie, she has this Honda Civic that is sort of, she only drives in town. She doesn't really sort of get oil changes very often. The more variety I have in those Honda Civics, the more likely it is that the make and model, the thing I have in common with these cars, is what makes them reliable. Right. You also need to consider the relevance. So, well, what kind of similarities do they have, and are those relevant to the similarity that occurs in your conclusion? So, for instance, if I said, hey, look, my car that I'm thinking about buying is similar to Colin's, and Colin's has been reliable, therefore mine will be, and you say, well, how is the car you're thinking about buying similar to Colin's? And I say, well, they're both silver. Well, okay, yeah, having the same color is a genuine similarity between the two cars, but the color of the car, that similarity, that observed similarity, is not relevant. There's no connection between the color of the car and the reliability of that car. So that would not be a very strong argument from analogy in that case. So one way to challenge an argument from analogy is by giving disanalogies. Right. So you can show the differences between the things being compared. Now note, it's also important to make sure that these differences are relevant differences. So if you try to challenge when I say, hey, look, Colin and I both have sort of Honda Civics, Colin's has been reliable, so mine probably will too. And then you point out, yeah, but Colin's car is blue and yours is silver. So there's a difference between Colin's car and yours. Well, that doesn't hurt my sort of analogy because the color of the car is yet again irrelevant to the reliability. Another way to challenge an argument from analogy is by giving a counter analogy. The idea here is you give a new analogy that would lead to the opposite conclusion. So for instance, maybe I initially say, hey, look, Colin has a Honda Civic. I'm thinking about buying a Honda Civic. Colin's car has been really reliable. Therefore, mine probably will as well. Well, one way to challenge my argument to say maybe it's not as strong as I think is to say, hey, look, but Susie also has a Honda Civic and hers has been incredibly unreliable. And so given that your car is similar to Susie's, that would sort of give evidence that yours would be unreliable as well. So in this case, the author's original analogy leads to the conclusion that something has F, and your new analogy leads to the conclusion that A doesn't have F. So the first one leads to the claim that your car would be reliable. The second one leads to the claim that the car would not be reliable. And so those opposing analogies seem to cancel each other out until we at least get maybe some further information or reasoning. A third way to challenge an argument from analogy is to point out that the analogy would have unintended implications. The idea here is you show how if we accept that analogy between the two things, it would lead to additional conclusions that seem implausible or that sort of contradict some of the other things that the author believes. The idea here is that this would show how the analogy comes with extra baggage that the person giving the argument wanted to avoid. And so the lesson is supposed to be that if they want to avoid that extra baggage, they're going to have to find a different way to defend their view, to defend their conclusion that doesn't rely on the analogy that they were using. All right, so that's all for this video. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.